Europe is being pulled apart by competing forces and difficult choices. On one side is the need to protect its own sovereignty and long-term interests. On the other is the ever-tightening grip of the United States, demanding loyalty even when it comes at a cost. Since the Biden administration took office, Europe has followed a series of questionable paths, particularly in its approach to China. Tariffs have been slapped on Chinese electric vehicles and solar panels in a move that seemed more like panic than strategy. In response, China finally pushed back, sanctioning 2 European banks and cutting them off from the Chinese market. An early warning, not a knockout punch, but clear enough to signal what lies ahead if Europe continues on its current trajectory. This tit-for-tat escalation didn't come out of nowhere. The EU had already sanctioned Chinese banks for doing business with Russia, and now the consequences are beginning to unfold. Europe is walking a tightrope. Either keep aligning with U.S. policies at the expense of its own economy, or step back and face Washington's backlash. Some countries, like Hungary and Spain, are quietly exploring a path toward better relations with China. But most of Europe remains tethered to Washington. Despite years of trade friction under Trump and ongoing tensions under Biden, the U.S. still exerts enormous influence, and Europe has yet to break free. Italy is a telling case. Its government has been trying to reduce Chinese investment in key sectors, branding it as de-risking. But in reality, it means walking away from valuable Chinese capital, expertise, and access to massive markets, something Europe desperately needs right now. Why? Because they're afraid of Washington's response. Look at Pirelli. A Chinese firm owns over a third of the company. You'd think that's a win for Italy in terms of exports to China. But no. Pirelli's Chinese ties have become a liability, even causing problems in the U.S. market, where national security concerns now affect everything from Formula One tires to factory supply chains. The mere presence of Chinese investment is enough to trigger restrictions. It's the same story in the energy sector. Italian energy companies can't move forward on U.S.-linked projects simply because they have Chinese shareholders. Europe is being cornered. Despite America cutting funding and raising tariffs, Europe isn't free to pivot. It can't lean fully into China, and it can't walk away from the U.S. And as this economic trap tightens, Europe's still tangled in the Russia mess. The EU is preparing its 19th round of sanctions against Moscow, but it's unclear who they're hurting more. Russia's economy, though dented, is surviving. Oil revenue has slowed, but new industries are growing, helped along by China and India, who continue doing business with Moscow. Europe, meanwhile, cut itself off from cheap Russian energy and is now spending billions on alternatives, at great cost and with little benefit. Europe's global influence is fading while the U.S. consolidates its leadership. Even on major issues, Europe is increasingly sidelined, excluded from high-level talks like the Alaska Summit. And economically, the toll is clear. German exports to China have dropped sharply since 2022. Chinese companies are manufacturing their own auto parts and machinery, and they no longer need European imports. At the same time, European goods are becoming less competitive, more expensive, not necessarily better, and harder to sell in foreign markets. China doesn't need European products anymore, but Europe still relies heavily on Chinese components to keep manufacturing costs down. And at the same time, it's still desperate to maintain access to the U.S. market. Trying to balance both sides is failing miserably. The EU has lost leverage. Its trade deficit with China has doubled since 2020. Even with tariffs in place, Europe keeps importing far more than it exports. And when Russian supply lines were cut, the resources didn't reroute to Europe. They went straight to China. Now Europe wants to boost exports of cars and aircraft parts to the U.S. That sounds like a win, until you realize many of the raw materials still come from China. So even if Europe tries to distance itself, the structure of today's global supply chain keeps pulling it back in. Dependency has become structural, and now Washington is escalating the pressure. The message is clear. The time has come for Europe to fully commit. That means tightening sanctions, further isolating Russia, and going harder on China, and even India. The U.S. is setting the agenda, and Europe is expected to follow. Treasury officials from Washington are now effectively shaping European policy. It's not just uncomfortable, it's humiliating. But what choice does Europe really have? Say no, and Trump could return to power and slap double tariffs on European exports, potentially gutting industries like Germany's car sector. Europe is stuck, squeezed by obligations to the U.S., economic reliance on China, and the fallout from cutting ties with Russia. It faces mounting pressure from every angle, with no clear way out. The U.S. is no longer just targeting rivals. It's leaning harder on its own allies, demanding they fall in line. The ultimate goal is broader, to isolate and weaken BRICS, the growing coalition led by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, now expanding into a larger global bloc. The official excuse? Continued BRICS purchases of Russian oil. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. The deeper strategy is geopolitical. Choke BRICS' access to key markets, starting with Europe, and reduce their global economic influence. Washington wants the EU to impose steep tariffs on BRICS economies, especially China and India, cutting them off from the European consumer base. But here's the irony. Europe's economy is not built for this kind of confrontation. It can't afford to play the enforcer. Across the continent, people are already feeling the strain. Wages are flat, inflation hasn't disappeared, and energy prices remain unstable after Ukraine. If American households are struggling with debt, things are even worse for European consumers, who are dealing with stagnation, high costs, and growing uncertainty. Yet in the middle of all this, the pressure keeps mounting. The US is pushing harder, demanding more, and Europe, locked into a web of dependencies, has no easy exit. It's a geopolitical squeeze with no relief in sight. Europe's economies are already showing signs of long-term fatigue, and if they choose to mirror Washington's aggressive posture, they could push themselves to the brink. The irony is stark. Many of the goods Europe would now be cutting off come from the very nations that power its supply chains. China and India are not just trade partners. They are deeply woven into the fabric of European manufacturing. From chemicals to electronics to pharmaceuticals, BRICS countries provide the raw materials and intermediate goods Europe depends on. Severing those ties wouldn't just be symbolic, it would be self-sabotage. Replacing such deeply embedded supply chains isn't just difficult, it's economically punishing. Europe would be forced to scramble for new suppliers, most likely at far higher prices and with uncertain reliability. That's a logistical and financial challenge Europe is nowhere near ready to face. And unlike the US, which trades less with BRICS nations, Europe is far more exposed. Over 23% of EU trade flows through BRICS plus economies, while the US figure sits lower at 16.7%. That gap isn't minor. It reveals a fundamental vulnerability. Europe has far more to lose. In contrast, BRICS countries have diversified away from Western dependency. Less than 15% of their trade ties back to Europe. Under 10% connects to the US. Their economic strategies have been clear. They're looking south and east, building partnerships across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. This isn't coincidence. It's insurance. So the reality is blunt. Europe needs BRICS more than BRICS needs Europe. That imbalance makes the current Western strategy dangerously short-sighted. If the US and EU move forward with sanctions and trade restrictions, BRICS will retaliate. Tariffs, export bans, supply chain realignments, none of these are hypothetical. They are well within reach, and they would hit Europe hard. Input costs would soar. Export demand would shrink. Economic momentum would slow. It would be like tearing bricks from the foundation of your own house, expecting it to stand upright. And this isn't hyperbole. It's basic math. Last year alone, Europe exported nearly $450 billion in goods to BRICS plus nations and imported around $750 billion in return. This isn't luxury consumption. These are essentials. Rare earth minerals, key raw materials, energy, components. Cut that stream and you don't just face inconvenience, you face industrial disruption. And there is no fast fix. Domestic capacity can't fill the void, not at scale, not at speed, and certainly not at comparable cost. This is why analysts are raising red flags. If Europe continues to align itself with Washington's economic aggression, it risks more than just short-term pain. It risks entrenching itself into a new kind of dependency on American industry, American finance, and American political priorities. And that runs directly counter to the EU's long-stated ambition of strategic autonomy. The outcome wouldn't be independence, but entanglement. Europe would lose control of its economic destiny, just as the global order is shifting away from Western dominance. At the same time, the US is escalating another front in this high-stakes reshaping, the global semiconductor war. Donald Trump, one of the movement's loudest voices, has pledged to raise tariffs on imported chips to 300%. That's not a negotiating tactic. That's a direct assault on the current global tech infrastructure. Triple the cost of foreign chips, and US consumers and businesses pay the difference. Electronics prices spike. AI startups, defense contractors, biotech firms all start to bleed margin. The message is simple. If chip makers won't move to the US, America will make it painful to stay elsewhere. But relocation isn't a magic bullet. Bringing chip production from Asia to American soil involves more than policy. It requires time, talent, and trillions. Plants take years to build. Scaling them to global capacity takes even longer. And the costs in the US, labor, materials, regulation, are all higher. Even if the US wins the production battle, it may lose the efficiency war. And this strategy isn't occurring in a vacuum. China is already counterpositioning. It holds critical control over rare earth exports, without which chips don't get made. If China decides to tighten that grip, U.S. semiconductor ambitions could stall before they even begin. Meanwhile, China's own chip R&D is accelerating fast. Last year alone, their spending rose 20%, and over the last 15 years, it's grown fivefold. They're closing the technology gap and already developing viable domestic alternatives to Western chips. The longer the West drags its feet, the more time China gains to consolidate its lead. So now the picture sharpens. The U.S. wants to rewire global trade and dominate future-proof industries. But it lacks the raw materials, industrial depth, and time to pull it off cleanly. Europe is being drawn into this effort, expected to shoulder risk for Washington's strategic goals. But the deeper both go into this confrontation, the more they risk cutting themselves off from the very global ecosystem they once ruled. This is no longer about simple trade imbalances or geopolitical alliances. It's about the tectonic shifts in how the global system functions. The rules of globalization are being rewritten. Supply chains are reorienting. Influence is drifting away from the West. The US and Europe are now faced with a choice: evolve with the new global order, or resist it through tariffs, sanctions, and strategic pressure. But the harder they resist, the more likely they are to build barriers that lock them in, not others out.